Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom of me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more crying, no more crying, no more crying over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. They'll be singing, they'll be singing, they'll be singing over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom of me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
So, we start off with a presentation of arms. We have the presenters of arms here.
The arms?
Attention! There's one. Oh, here, okay, go ahead.
Attention, color guard. Shoulder. Arms. Present. Arms. Ready for the national anthem, sir.
Oh, okay. So, Jessie Doyle?
No, Jessie Holt.
Holt, I'm sorry.
You know I am Black Irish, that's okay.
Okay.
And I love Guinness, so there you go. Please take your hats off. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rapid red glare that was bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does the star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Drop your pen. Sorry, drop the pen.
Order. Earth. Break ranks. March. Huzzah.
There you go. I have to say, Jessie probably is the highlight of our presentation. So, I'd like to begin by reading you a passage from a book, okay, which I find really sort of summing up the whole situation with Thaddeus Stevens. And this was a book published in 1939, a biography of Thaddeus Stevens. And it echoes what a lot of other biographies say about Thaddeus Stevens, which is, why doesn't anybody know about him? Let me get to that, the proper place here. He says, it is ironic commentary on fame that in so short a time as 70 years, Thaddeus Stevens has become little more than a name even to well-educated Americans. In his lifetime, which reached its climax during a major crisis in American affairs, he was the most powerful political figure in the land and exercised a control over legislation never equaled before or since. At his death, he was accorded tributes which, like those paid Abraham Lincoln himself, the effect of his policies persists down to the present. Moreover, he was an enthralling, idiomatic individual about whom legends clustered which seemed to contain all the elements of permanent folklore. His blighting wit alone should have rendered his memory secure. Yet today, by some inexplicable quirk of fate, the emphasis of history, of tradition, of common repute have somehow been diverted, and to mention Stevens is to loose a flood of shamefaced ignorance. Well, today we're taking steps to remedy that by having the first Thaddeus Stevens Museum where people can come and learn about him. And I'm looking forward to the day when I don't refer to him as the greatest unknown person in American history. But one thing I really want to do before I recognize some other people to talk is I'd like to really thank all the support I've had over the years to do this. This would have been impossible by myself. And we just have such a great group for the Thaddeus Stevens Society that is generous and also willing to work. So I think you ought to give an applause just for the members and supporters of the Thaddeus Stevens Society. So right now I'd like to recognize Matthew Moon, the president of the Gettysburg Borough Council. Unfortunately, the mayor came down with a sickness and she won't be able to be here today. So here is Matthew. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
You might want to get a little closer.
I might.
Okay.
My name is Matthew Moon, and I serve the residents of Gettysburg's 2nd Ward on the Borough Council. I want to thank this museum for inviting me here today to share a few thoughts. I am not a historian, and I'm not necessarily one who spends a lot of time looking backwards, except in that it does inform how we do and why we must look forward. I do not believe that Gettysburg is a static place where we must be locked in one state forever. Rather, I believe it must be a growing, vibrant, living community. It is to that end that I will tell you that I am a fan of Thaddeus Stevens. By some accounts, he was not a pleasant man to spend time with, and an even less pleasant man to disagree with. But he serves as a reminder of two things for me. First, that you do not have to be popular to be right. And second, that trying to get along with people who would use their privilege to continue the subjugation of other human beings is wasted energy. We do not need to make friends with people who believe they were born superior. Current events have shown us that even now, in the 21st century, there are political forces who actively attempt to revise our history and deny the truth that our nation was founded on the concept of every human being's innate equality. But sometimes we have failed to realize that. Our original sin of slavery, the barbarity of the 3/5 compromise, institutionalized race-based policy for the allotment of power and money amongst an aristocratic elite, Japanese internment camps, Chinese exclusion acts, Jim Crow, the genocide of the native peoples and the destruction of their cultures and languages, the fact that women have had to wait and still wait for codified equality. This is the unfinished work that Mr. Lincoln referred to when he was here. Great things happen here. Great things will continue to happen here. Though we shared him with other towns, Thaddeus Stevens was one of our own. When we reflect on his legacy of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we see a simple, common man who knew that we must use power to share power. When I send my kids to public schools in this Commonwealth, it is with the knowledge that education is the equalizer. Power wants us dumb. It wants us combative, and it wants us to other those who do not act like us or look like us. Education tells us these myths are false, and that the sharing of power reinforces the dream that our founders had, that we could create a new world without kings and despots. And that is why education and the 14th Amendment are under attack today by forces that would not share power if given their preference. Thaddeus Stevens reminds us that freedom requires vigilance. We are finally starting as a community to acknowledge the impacts of Thaddeus Stevens, and I express my gratitude to the society that has kept his vision sacred, and I would ask that you all remember what is at stake with every election. Thank you.
Now I'd like to recognize Randy File, the chairman of the county commissioners, which I also believe you have a proclamation for us.
Well, first you have to put up with a few remarks. But hopefully, like Abe Lincoln, even though we're here honoring Thaddeus Stevens, they'll be short and appropriate. So it really is truly an honor for me personally to be here this evening and also representing the residents of Adams County. I spent 35 or 30 years with the National Park Service, and really, Thaddeus Stevens did not come up very much. And with the opening of this museum, we are recognizing a stalwart and a giant facilitator of not only our town of Gettysburg, of Adams County, our state of Pennsylvania, and our nation, who chose the path of leaning into the prevailing winds instead of taking the easy path of drifting with the winds. Few historical figures have done so much to impact their community at every level and receive so little recognition. My first acquaintance with Mr. Stevens was almost 20 years ago when my wife gave me a gift, a signed copy of my friend, Dr. Brad Hoke's freshly published Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg, The Making of an Abolitionist. And I actually read the whole thing. But then some time passed, and he sort of faded in my memory. But the next time Stevens and I bumped into one another was when Kathy and I were vacationing in Florida and had some time to kill before flying out, and we went to see the movie Lincoln. As an Adams County and Gettysburg native, it made me realize that maybe Brad was onto something, writing about a guy who practiced law here for 26 years, from 1816 to 1842, and left a legacy of notable achievements at every level, from our public water system in Gettysburg, being a founder and savior of Gettysburg College, owning Caledonia Iron Works, planning the Tapeworm Railroad, which later became the bed of future railroads, being the father of public education in Pennsylvania, and embraced, supported, and played the key role to get the Emancipation Proclamation across the finish line. So I thought maybe I should just pay a little more attention to this guy who walked the same streets, practiced law in Gettysburg, and frequented some of the same establishments that we do. Now, fast forward to several years ago when the Board of Commissioners was approached by several parties to inquire about putting a statue of Thaddeus Stevens in front of the courthouse. Knowing Stevens' connection to our community, the board thought it was not only appropriate, but long overdue. The Thaddeus Stevens Society was chosen as the organization to make that happen. His statue stands prominently and appropriately in front of the Adams County Historic Courthouse, leaning into the prevailing winds, you might notice, as a symbol of what he meant to our community, our state, and our nation. It is very satisfying, I must tell you, to look out the courthouse window or drive by and frequently see pedestrians stopping to look at the statue and reading the narrative plaque. Congratulations to Ross and the Thaddeus Stevens Society for their enduring dedication and persistence, and for their facilitation of not only the courthouse statue and this museum that we are here to dedicate this evening. There is another page there. Ross, through your efforts and the efforts of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, may Thaddeus Stevens' accomplishments, values, and numerous contributions not be forgotten, but utilized as a preserved history lesson for future generations. So congratulations.
Thank you. Oh, this is nice. It has a frame too.
Yeah. We don't always frame them, but we framed it for Ross tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, on behalf of the Board of Commissioners and all the residents of Adams County, it's my honor and pleasure to present to the Thaddeus Stevens Society a proclamation from the Commissioners of Adams County. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I'll be repeating myself to some degree, but the proclamation for Thad's Place grand opening April 4th, 2024. So congratulations,
Thank you.
Ross.
Thank you very much.
Job well done.
Thank you very much. Very nice. You do a nice proclamation. Well, that will end our observances here. I believe, are we still have something from the presenting arms?
Good, thank you.
You're good. Okay.
Everybody's got arms.
Okay, everybody has arms. Okay. So in any case, we are going to have a banquet at 7 o'clock. And, we have been getting people to sign up for that. But at this point, we have room for 50 people. We only have 30 people who signed up ahead of it. So if you're interested in coming to the banquet, come on down. And it will be right down here at that door. And now I got to find the caterer to see if they're, when they're setting up. This took a little less time than I thought, and they were thinking about 7 o'clock. So what I would suggest you do is spend some time in the museum and then come over a little before 7 o'clock, and I'll unlock the door so people can get in there. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Over 200 years old. So, I have a few questions about what I've seen. I've been wandering around Gettysburg here, and it's nice to see this nice little museum over here. The question is, where's the big one?
Well, unfortunately, it is the only museum. I'm sorry, and it did open just a month ago.
Okay. You're 100 years late. What can I say?
There is going to be another museum for you in Lancaster, hopefully by April of 2025.
Okay. Well, I do see that you have a statue up here. I guess that's been here about 100 years?
2.
2 years. Are there any others?
There is another one in Lancaster, and
100 years old?
2008.
2008.
Not quite.
Well, I looked around, and you have a lot of statues of Abraham Lincoln. You got 6. Why do you need so many of Abraham Lincoln? I mean, he came here for one day and had a Gettysburg Address. I had a Gettysburg Address for 26 years. I get 1 statue. But I have to say, Lincoln did listen to me sometimes. In fact, I tell people that the Union was blessed with 2 political geniuses, Abraham Lincoln and yours truly. And much of Abraham Lincoln's genius was that he listened to me. A lot of times he didn't listen to me and he regretted it. I remember one time, and this was after the fact, he asked me about the honesty, and he should have asked this before he appointed him. He asked me about the honesty of Simon Cameron, his Secretary of War. And as people who grew up at that time in Pennsylvania, he was a notoriously corrupt person. And so I said, well, this is all I can say about Simon Cameron is that he wouldn't steal a red-hot stove. Which Lincoln thought was a pretty funny joke, and he told Simon Cameron, who didn't think it was a very funny joke, and he demanded that I go back and retract it. So I went back to Lincoln, and I said, you know how I said he wouldn't steal a red-hot stove? Lincoln says, yes. And I said, well, I was wrong, he would. Another time, Lincoln asked me, and this is before he actually did it, he asked me, he did wise up to Simon Cameron and made him ambassador to Russia to get him away from everything. And when I heard that, I said, send word to the Tsar to bring in his things at night. On another occasion, before he did it, though he didn't listen to me on this occasion, he asked me about Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. And I told him directly, Andrew Johnson is a rank demagogue and a scoundrel to boot. Well, he went ahead and picked Andrew Johnson to be his vice president and then got himself shot. And of course, Andrew Johnson became president, which started an antagonistic situation between me and Andrew Johnson, because he wanted to lose the Civil War after the Civil War. Some of his friends came to me one time and said, you really should lighten up on Andrew Johnson because he's a self-made man just like yourself. And I said, well, I never really thought of it that way, but that would relieve God Almighty of a heavy responsibility. I also found out that whereas Egypt was plagued by lice in the death of the firstborn, we were plagued by Andrew Johnson. Now, as you can imagine, being very controversial, I did have political enemies who would ever so often come in contact with me. And I remember one particular time there was a political enemy in Lancaster who was walking down a narrow sidewalk, and I was coming towards him, and he scowled at me and he says, "I never stand aside for a skunk." And I stepped off the curb and I said, "But I always do." But on the other hand, I also had a lot of admirers who would come up to me and tell me how they admired me so much. And one particular time I had this lovely lady come up to me and said, "Mr. Stevens, you're such a great man. Can I have a lock of your hair?" And I said, "Sure, have the whole thing." Now, there was lots of things said about me, and I said the things, but I more or less had the last word on my epitaph, which is in a cemetery in Lancaster, which was the only integrated cemetery in Lancaster at that time. And it says, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules, I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his creator." With that said, thank you. I hope that grave is an inspiration to everybody. And I'd like to throw it open to questions from the audience, since all of you actually know who I am, as opposed to the general public. Any particular questions? No one has questions.
What's your favorite artifact in the museum that you just saw?
Let me think about that just for a second. My favorite artifact. There's so many.
The vending machine.
The vending machine. That is amazing vending machine. I mean, you can actually use a credit card. It's like a true, miracle of technology. Is you can get sustenance, without having to deal with people. But I would say it's interesting. Okay, it's a little bit of a story. I'm glad you asked it. I would say my favorite one is my letter to Edward McPherson, which is the blue one in the case, which was, by the way, donated by Seminary Ridge Museum. And that particular letter, written in 1851, was to Edward McPherson, who was a protege of mine. Edward McPherson was the son of John McPherson, who was a business partner of mine. And when I moved to Lancaster, I bought a newspaper, and I needed an editor. And Edward McPherson had been a journalist, and so I offered him the job of the editorship of the Independent Whig over in Lancaster. Yeah, the Whig here, but with an H. So in any case, he took the job, but it continued a relationship I had with him that stretched on for decades. And he played a pivotal role in saving the country. And I call it December 4th, 1865, the day that I and Edward McPherson saved the country. As everybody knows, Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865. And Andrew Johnson, the rank demagogue, became president. And while he was against secession, he was kind of okay with slavery. Okay. So in any case, he immediately, after he became president, started issuing pardons wholesale to all the ex-Confederates. And he allowed them to hold elections in the South. And not unsurprisingly, they elected Confederate officials. In fact, Alexander Stevens, no relation to me, and he spells his name wrong, was elected to the Senate. So they planned to join up with their Northern Democratic allies, take over the House and the Senate. And one of the most terrible things they were going to do was to reinstate slavery. And even though the 13th Amendment was on its way to being ratified, there was a loophole in it that said involuntary servitude was illegal except if you're a convict. So the South passed these black codes, which basically said all black people were convicts. And the way it worked is if you're a black person without a job, say you walk off the plantation, sheriff meets you, say you have a job? No? Well, you're a vagrant. And you're put back on the plantation as convict labor. So these were the stakes that we were facing on December 4th, 1865, when Congress reconvened. Back then, Congress didn't meet as often as it does now, and basically Johnson had a free hand from April until December. So the Southerners showed up on December 4th, 1865, expecting to take their seats. And Edward McPherson was the clerk of the House, a job I got him, just like the editorship of my newspaper. So we had come up with a plan. And like every other session of Congress, Edward McPherson started calling the roll, and he got to the Southern names, and he skipped them, didn't call them out. The Southerners jumped up and down with their Northern allies, said, you can't do that, you can't do that. I got up and said, point of order, we can conduct no business until the roll is called. The roll was finished, the Southerners were out, and that gave the Republicans a large majority to prevent Andrew Johnson from losing the Civil War after the Civil War. If we hadn't taken that particular action, you wouldn't have had a 14th Amendment, you wouldn't have had a 15th Amendment, you wouldn't have had Reconstruction. So it would have changed the whole course of history. We basically would have gone back to the way it was before the Civil War. So that's a long answer as to what my favorite artifact is because it concerned Edward McPherson. Yes?
Mr. Stevens, how much do you love James Buchanan?
Well, to tell you the truth, I had pretty normal relations with James Buchanan before he tried to make Kansas a slave state.
Yeah.
That was really kind of, in fact, when early on, I was, his administration and my time in Congress kind of overlapped from 1859 to 1861. And occasionally when I would talk before Congress, I would talk about the way I perceived James Buchanan's policies. And one time a colleague of mine got him and says, what makes you able to talk about what James Buchanan thinks? And I said, well, you have to understand, he's one of my constituents. And the reply was, well, I certainly hope that you represent your other constituents better than you do James Buchanan. So it was off and on. Yes?
Are you surprised to find that there's a president who historians now rank below Lockjaw Buchanan?
By the way, the lockjaw comment, for people who are not aware of that, yes, in the 1856 election, I campaigned against James Buchanan, and I told people that there was a misconception that there was a candidate by the name of James Buchanan. James Buchanan had died of lockjaw, and all that was left was a pile of political putridity. He didn't seem to like that. But I'm not going to really comment on current politics. I'll just let the 14th Amendment talk for itself.
Section 2 or 3?
Section 3.
Section 3.
Which, by the way, I didn't really like. It was actually, I wanted to disenfranchise all Confederates for 2 years. Yeah. So they actually changed it so that it would prevent people involved in insurrections from holding office, which makes it applicable to the 21st century, though the Supreme Court decides what's applicable and what's not. So you had a question.
In our youth in this county, there was a prevailing impression, sir, Mr. Stevens, that you came here to Gettysburg as a blacksmith. Could you enlighten us about your adventures in the iron trade?
No, I was not a blacksmith. And it has that is a lot of confusion because the last remaining building at my iron mill says Thaddeus Stevens Blacksmith. Though that is a noble trade, and I'm sure that I would have done well in that. But I was the owner of the iron mill operation, which consisted of 18,000 acres and employed 250 people. And it was always the biggest mistake in my life because I constantly lost money there. And then when I started making a little bit of money, the Confederates burnt it to the ground. And so I had to restart that. So I would have been much better off if I had just stuck with law, being an attorney. So that's the end of the questions. Thank you very much for celebrating my birthday, and I hope you enjoy it.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Thaddeus. Yes. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much.
You have a reputation to maintain, don't you?
Gettysburg, the sun was high, and freedom left her haughty fall beneath the northern sky. On the parade of the north that swelled the grand array, there flew like mountain eagles from happy homes away. There stood a man upon the famous spire of children three, and gazed with an a pictured frame their happy homes to see. Blame him not if in his strife he breathed the soldier's prayer. Oh, Father, shield the soldier's wife, and for his children care. And for his children care. Upon the field of Gettysburg, when morning shone again, the crimson cloud of battle burst in streams of fiery rain. Our legions quelled the awful flood of shot, steel, and shell, while banners marked with ball and blood around them rose and fell. None more nobly won the name of champion of the free than he who crossed the little frame that held the children three. None was braver in his strife than he who breathed the prayer. Oh, Father, shield the soldier's wife, and for his children care. And for his children